A little over 4 years ago, I built this scene to show this character running through snow. Let's go ahead and push play and take a look at what happens. So as you can see, as she runs through the snow, she's leaving footprints on the ground. Here's just a few different angles of the same thing. And there's a couple ways that we could go about doing this. We could build a set of morph targets for the ground object so that as the foot hits, we just apply the morph that dents in the object. We could use displacement maps, but in the case of this setup, I use dynamics. So what I thought we could do is take a look at how we can use cloth dynamics to make footprints in the ground, whether it's snow, sand, mud. It all kind of works the same. You just change the settings. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this, and we'll go ahead and set up our objects to recreate what's going on in the scene. So we'll start by creating our ground object. I'm just going to come over to the Create tab, choose Box, and let's just draw out a flat plane here. Now we could build a really large ground area, but I figure if we're going to be showing off footprints, the camera's probably going to be zoomed in. We just need an area, but it all would work the same. I'm going to go ahead and use the up arrow key and add some segments. Use the right arrow key and add some segments. I'm going to make this a subpatch object, so I could probably get away with just a few segments, but I'm going to go ahead and use this many. We can always dial it in, change our subpatch level at any time. So I'll go ahead and commit to that. And the only thing I need to do now is hit Tab so that it's a subpatch object. And let's go ahead and give it a surface. Not a requirement, but it'll dress it up a little bit. So Q for change surface, and we'll make this ground, and we'll do kind of like that snowy ground that we had earlier. Turn smoothing on. Okay, so now we have our object. We just need to save it. So File, Save Object. We'll call this Snow Ground 001. Save, and we'll send it over to Layout. So send object to Layout. Okay, so now we have our ground object, and let's get it set up. So the first thing we need is something to collide with it so that it can leave a footprint. We'll start off, we'll maybe change this later, but we'll start off by just adding a null object. Actually, you know what? Instead of a null, let's just go ahead and jump right into making it a collision object. So we'll go to Add Dynamic Object, Collision, and we'll call this foot. Okay, and we'll just leave the default settings. We'll use bounce, and we'll keep the size and everything. This will work. So now what I need to do is set up just a real simple animation so that we can see what's going to happen. On frame 0, I'll raise up the collision object. On frame 10, I'll push the collision object in to the ground, and on frame 15, I'll raise it up. Okay, and if I scrub through, we can see it's just going to dip into the ground. So now all I need to do is set up dynamics on the ground so that we can have it affected by the collision object. So we're just going to kind of zoom in so that we can see what happens here. So I selected the ground object, P for properties, come over here to the dynamics tab, add dynamic, and we'll add cloth. Click for the settings, and we'll jump right over to collision. And for collision detect, we'll say all surfaces. And we see the points on the surface. It shows what's going to be affected with the collision. And let's just use the default settings and see what happens. So I'm going to calculate. And it pushes in, and it just keeps weighing down. Let me just kind of rotate around here a little bit so we can see. So it pushes in, and that's definitely not what we want for our footprint. So we're going to need to adjust the settings a little bit. Okay, I'm looking at this, and I'm seeing that it is indenting it, but and I don't have gravity. Let's take a look. It's set to gravity 0, but it's really pulling that down. So I'm thinking that the first place we might want to adjust is the weight. So I'm going to lower it really low. I'm actually going to go below 1, because right now 1's too much, so let's do 0.05 and calculate. Okay, it dents it, but it doesn't pull it down that much. That actually looks like we're close. but I'm going to lower the spring value. Let me zoom in a little bit more so we can see what's going on. Okay, so it dents it, and yeah, it kind of leaves a footprint, but I want it to be a little less, have a little less spring to it. So I'm just going to drop this, and I like going extreme, so I'm going to drop it down to 1, and then we can always adjust from there. So calculate. It dents it. Oh wow, and it pretty much stays as far as I've pushed it down, like if it were a footprint. Now I'm looking at this and I'm saying, wow, that's maybe a little more detailed than I want. So one thing that I could do is come over to my geometry tab, and for subdivision order, instead of having it at first, meaning that it's going to subdivide all those polygons and make it a polygonal mesh, let's work with fewer points. So I'll change it to last. Come over to the dynamics and calculate. See how it's a little softer? That's because it's using less points, so it's going to be softer. So it does the dynamics and then it subdivides. Okay, but that's really not a foot. I mean, it's just a representation of the foot. So why don't we work with a foot object? And also that way you can see how to go about, if you don't want to use one of the default collision objects like what we're using right now, we can use an actual object. Okay, so why don't we go over to Modeler, and I've got one pre-built that we can take a look at. I'm going to open up Footprint. Let's take a look at this. Okay, so it's just a basic little cartoon foot, but we can see that there's some toes and the base foot, and I don't have anything up top, but that's okay because that's not going to make contact with it. Now it could be as detailed as we want. Just know the more points that you have, the longer the calculation is going to be. We've got quite a few points here, especially since we just need the basic shape. I could remove some of this, but we'll leave it and see what happens. So I'm going to send this over to layout, and instead of having to reanimate it, I'm just going to turn parent in place off, M for motion options, and I'm going to parent it to the foot. Okay, so we now have this happening. Okay, so we'll see if we can turn this into a collision object. Actually, just so that we have no confusion, I'm going to unparent that. I'm going to remove the collision object from the scene, and in that way we know that it is this foot that is going to be doing the work. So it's already in the ground. I'm going to push it in the ground a little bit more and keyframe that at keyframe 10, and at frame 1 I'll come up here, pushes down, and at 15, like we did before, I'll raise it up. Now I don't have the collision object in there, but it's leaving a dent. That's because it's still remembering the calculation from before, but that's okay because we're going to recalculate. But first we need to tell dynamics, we need to tell layout that this is going to be a dynamic object. So we'll go to P for properties, dynamics, and instead of adding cloth, we're going to add collision. It already knows to set it as an object instead of a sphere, box, wall, because we're adding it to an object. So we'll go ahead and calculate, and we can see that the foot has now left an impression. Okay, now if we want it to be more that shape, remember, all we need to do is come over to the geometry tab, make sure we choose the ground, and under subdivision order, set it to first, which is going to give us more points. It's going to take a little bit longer to calculate, but it'll still work for us. So we'll head over to calculate, and now it's going to leave more of that impression in the ground, okay, based on the shape of the foot. So depending on what you want, I actually prefer the look of last. It's not as close to the shape, but it makes a nice soft impression as if it's soft powdery snow. Okay, and it stays like that. Now this works so far, and we could have multiple, we could turn the feet of the character into the collision object, which is what I did in the scene that I showed earlier. So everywhere the foot everywhere one of the foot hits the ground, feet hits the ground, you can make it a collision object with the dynamic object. But what if you don't want these particular settings, and the settings that you like are are manipulating the mesh and it never kind of comes to a stop. It never, like, it just keeps rippling or keeps moving. Well, we can get that working as well. So what I'm going to do is just change. First, I'm going to close this and change my animation just, or actually a lot, just so that we can get a couple footsteps in there. So I'm going to select my collision object and kill these keyframes. Delete keys. Okay. And I'm going to move my foot over to here. Come over to frame 5. Move it a little bit. Frame 10, move it down so that I get a footprint down. Come over to frame 15, move it up. Frame 20, maybe move it down a little bit. So down, up, down. Except I am going to move this over some because it was too close to the other footprint. And move this over some. So we go 1, 2. We'll do one more. So come over here, raise it up, come over to frame 30, bring it down some, and then we'll just come back up. Okay, something like that. I'm going to go ahead and recalculate, but instead of going over to the Properties panel, I'm going to come over to the Modify tab and choose IKB Calculate. It's the same kind of calculation. Okay, so we have this giant trench. It's pretty deep, but we're going to change it up and come up with a different effect, and then I can show you how, if it keeps moving, how you can make it stop and end up with a different look. So we'll come back over to Cloth Effects, P for Properties, Cloth Effects, and we'll choose for Spring, let's just go crazy and go 40,000. And for Viscosity, we'll go 5. For the substructure, we'll go 10. Hold structure, we'll do 50. Come over to the Advanced tab and change the compressed stress to 50 and the stretch limit to 50. And I'm just putting in some numbers just to mix it up some. Might not like the result, but we'll see. So it hits. Okay, so it goes down and it reforms the shape. See how it's not really leaving the footprints, not like before. So what I'm going to do is tweak the settings just a little bit, but I still don't want it to leave the footprints. Okay, there we go. That's enough. It gives us an idea. Okay, it's rippling the whole sheet and it's kind of raising back up. Let's give it a little bit of weight, 0.2. And here's the fun part. There we go. Here's the fun part of working with dynamics, is that you get to tweak it and get the exact look you're after. And you just have to tweak a few numbers. And because you can quickly calculate, you can get almost instant feedback, which allows you to really play with the settings a little bit. But this is going to work. See how it pushes in, but then it's going to kind of settle back? Well, I don't want it to settle back, but I like the ripples that it's giving that maybe I wasn't getting with the other settings. So here's what we can do. I'm going to take and have it so that when it hits down and I get the shape that I'm after, I'm going to fix it into place. And in order to do that, I need to come over to Collision and choose Fix by Event. And now I just need an event to happen in order for that to take place. So one way I can do that is to come over here, and I'm just going to clone this object, Items, Clone. So there's actually 2 of them. I'm going to offset, I'm going to grab the second one. I'm going to grab all these frames in the dope track. I'm just going to offset them by, say, 5. So what happens is the second foot is going to follow behind a few frames later. Okay, 5 frames later. And then instead of making it this foot shape, I'm going to go to P for Properties. It's already got collision attached to it because it's the same setup as the other of the original foot. For the object type, I'm going to choose box. The radius is set to 0. Well, I'm going to change that to 1. Let's change it to 3. Actually, that's too big. I'm going to change it to 2 and dial it back just a little bit. Come over here, H, stretch it wide. Don't worry about the foot. We can always, well, I'll just replace it with a null. Okay, but it still has the settings. We just don't need to see it. Nulls don't render, and we don't need that extra foot. And the last thing I need to do is take this box and set the mode from bounce. I'm going to set it to event. Okay, and I'm going to close this. I can hit calculate, but I want you to see what's happening while it's calculating. And we'll come over to modify, calculate. Oh, and I actually set a keyframe because it already had keyframes. See how it shrunk? So I'm not getting 100% what I want. You can already see that it's locking that into place, but it's not locking the entire sheet into place. But that's okay. We'll come over to the graph editor, and under scale, let's see, scale, we did it in the X. So I'm just going to delete this keyframe right here, and now it stays the shape that we want. So now all I have to do is go to calculate, and I didn't get all of the frames, so I just need to change my location just a little bit. I didn't get all the points, I should say. So I'm going to lower this in the first keyframe. It's still going to come up, and then in the last keyframe I'm going to just lower that as well. So we'll calculate. Okay, and now we get a different type of effect, right? Because it's got different cloth effect settings, but I can still lock it into place so that after it stamps into the ground, it doesn't move anymore. So fix by event allows us to do that. So there you go, a couple ways of working with dynamics to put footprints and dents and things like that in the ground using collision objects. So you can use that as an option. Don't forget, you can also use morph targets and displacement maps and stuff like this, but I think this is fairly easy to set up. And again, the benefit is that if you go to change up your animation, all you have to do is recalculate. You don't have to build new morphs or change where the displacement's taking place. So using cloth dynamics to put footprints into the ground.